We're back with the Cycle World podcast. I'm Mark Hoyer, the editor-in-chief, and I'm with Kevin Cameron, our technical editor, as ever, as usual. And our topic this week is how Royal Enfield is taking over the world, because they are. It's been a miraculous transformation of a brand that was almost out of business, and now it's closing in
and
on...
which traveled halfway around the earth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's closing in on 1 million units a year globally, which is crazy. The first thing I wrote about essentially for the magazine was a Royal Enfield Bullet 500 in 1999. I went in my first editorial meeting with, all these experienced Cycle World editors, and I walked in and they said, "Hey, we're going to, have you test this Royal Enfield, and have you test this Royal Enfield, and it's not a regular motorcycle. You could really flame this thing to the ground. It's not a Honda. You got to kind of take it for what it is. It's essentially, at the time, it was essentially a 1955 Royal Enfield, 1901, England, built like a gun, all that stuff. They were an arms manufacturer, and they were having financial problems, and they had taken the Enfield to India and were manufacturing it in India. They were using it for the military, and they essentially, even when Enfield itself, the British version of Enfield, went out of business, Enfield India continued making these bikes, and they wove themselves into, they were fixable. They made the Beat, which was very important, the big 500 single, 350 single, boop, boop, boop. But by 1999, it was essentially the same motorcycle. I mean, it had some carburation updates and a few things, but my bike vibrated so much it made me itchy. It was very difficult to shift at times. It just was very, pretty rough and ready. The importer at the time was Kevin Mahoney. I think in 99 it was Kevin Mahoney. And he certainly was in 08 when we went to India, which I'll get to, but it vibrated. It was hard to start. And Kevin said, well, they're bikes that require an explanation. When you went to buy them, they were hand pinstriped and there were flaws, it wasn't mechanized. But that was the humanity of these bikes as well. So, teetering on the brink of destruction, and Siddhartha Lal, son of Vikram Lal, they acquired the company in 2001. He was 26 years old, and it was his project. He loved that's one of the things about Siddhartha Lal, is he loves motorcycling. And so you have an enthusiastic 26-year-old, and he wanted to, change the world. And
think of the energy.
Yes. And he set to work. So, I rode the bike, and it was charming, and it did require explanation, and there were, it was something. But in 08, they came out with the unit construction engine, which was their first new engine. It was essentially their evolution. The Harley Davidson Evo came in the 80s and really changed course for Harley, modernized what they were doing, fixed leaks and made them run better. And, Evo was a real lifesaver for them. And that's what the UCE was. It was 500 and 350. It was fuel injected. It was mapped to at least 18,530 feet because of the Himalayas, or Himalayas, as you wish. And it could run at 70 all day. It was by all accounts a modern motorcycle. And at that time, I'll read the quote. I met Siddhartha Lal in Chennai, where the factory is. And I saw two factories, in fact. I saw the old factory, which was dirty and dark, and they were bolting engine cases to fixtures and pulling great big levers with cutting fluid going over it. And it was really crazy. And then we went to the modern area where they were building the UCE, and they had like CNC sealant machines, putting perfect gray beads of sealant around the engine cases, and they were assembly was brightly lighted, and there were all these new folks building motorcycles. So I sit down with Sid Lal and kind of close my story on the UCE of riding it in India and testing that new bike. And he says, we have low cost manufacturing. We have a heritage you cannot buy off the shelf. We have a name you cannot buy off the shelf. Our cash reserves are good. The Classic is just our first product designed for international markets. Over the next 15 to 20 years, you'll see more specific bikes for the US and Europe and other bikes for India. And here we are. That was 2008. We're nearly 20 years. We're 15, 17 years on. And at the time in the story, 07, I think, was 45,000 units. I think around 1999, it might have been 25,000 units. And last year was 944,000 units. And we have
Good one.
yeah, we have the INT, we have the 650 platform, we have the Himalayan, originally 411 and now 450-ish, and all the variety of bikes. They make the 350 single, and they really focused on the fun. And I mean, it is a culture and a soul, the way Harley Davidson is. It's just the Indian version of it.
Yes, because it is all India, this motorcycle. When India side was selling motorcycles, they decided to get into manufacturing them, and they assembled from parts sent from England, and then using production machines bought from the English company, they began to make many of their own components. And presently, they were able to build the motorcycle 100% in India. And that's the way it has been ever since. Now, when you look at the specs, at first, they're unimpressive. But this is a motorcycle that allows you to choose the roll. It's not going to impose a roll on you, for example, by making 200 horsepower. It is a useful, reliable motorcycle. And when I look back on the history of the American market, I see that the leading edge of the Japanese import scheme was 50cc step-throughs, then 100s, 125s, 250s. And as the sales have moved to the head of the line, the larger displacements, the smaller displacements have been abandoned. And so many people who learned to ride motorcycles in that time said, I had so much fun on those little bikes. I had no idea motorcycling was like that. Because you socially were strongly inhibited from going near motorcycles because, as the late Phil Schilling once put it, people feared that they would give you tattoos. And I think that the spirit of Royal Enfield's exports is, this is a motorcycle. Make of it what you will. And we know that those 50cc step-throughs were made to carry the whole family plus a goat. And you'll find that in Southeast Asia.
Working motors.
Yes, a working motorcycle.
Working motorcycles in India. So the Indian market is variously between 15 and 20 million units a year. Most of those are sort of in the 150 range, and it's Bajaj and TVS or the partner bikes, Hero, Honda, etc. And they're sort of $1,200 to $1,500 brand new, and they're bought with loans. That was the discussion I had in 08 with talking about the Indian market. And we saw families of 5 and, carrying a 10-pound bag of rice in addition to the whole family, like little kids, little babies. And I mean, it was epic. It was beautiful, like rebar and furniture. It was so resourceful. It just makes you feel ridiculous over here because you need a an 8,000-pound pickup truck
Yes.
to pick up 4 sticks of lumber like I do at the hardware store or whatever. But yeah, an amazing market, and motorcycling is fundamental transportation in the Indian market. Or Enfield was an aspirational brand. It had been around so long, it was sort of woven into the psyche, and it was bigger. It was 350s and 500s, and so that was kind of getting up market. It was sort of the luxury bike for India.
Also, bear in mind that motorcycle registrations outnumber car registrations in India very considerably. So the motorcycle is still a useful working vehicle as well as being leisure entertainment. And this is really its role in Asia is for now is as a practical vehicle, but the Royal Enfield, being as aspirational as it is bigger. And then they had the idea, what if we export these? What if the traditional name, Royal Enfield from 1901, and the 1950s styling, because that's frankly where it starts, would strike a chord with people who, like myself, ask the question, where did regular motorcycles go? Now, I don't mean to say that present day mass market motorcycles and top end motorcycles aren't wonderful. They are wonderful. But there's a market niche here, and Royal Enfield intend to occupy it.
Well, their emphasis is middleweight bikes, and so they're not going over, say, 900 cc. So they're looking at that, and they're looking at emerging middle class in big markets like India, Brazil. They're in Thailand. They're looking at places where people are experiencing the ability to take the next step.
Coming up.
And when you have an economy and population the size of India, think of the number of people who would be entering the middle class, the possibility of the marketplace, what they call TAM, total addressable market, pretty darn big. If you're selling 20 million motorcycles in a market, think of how many of those you might wish to have be your own. So this is really, when I look back at interviewing Siddhartha Lal in Chennai at the factory and what he said during our interview, and he really set course at that time. It's really down to his leadership. And I think it's so essential that he loves motorcycles. I think many companies lose their way when you get somebody in who's, a washing machine executive or whatever, where it's different. It's not an emotional thing. You have to keep the essential personality and soul of the product and enhance the relationship, even as you modernize and reliabilitize. You've got to really keep the relationship going with the customer, and they've done an exceptional job of that at Enfield. And recently, 2 years ago, Meteor 650, which was their kind of cruiser bobberish one, we went to Rajasthan in India, Jaisalmer, and we rode around the desert, and we met director of design and all these other guys, and everyone said it really came down to Siddhartha Lal's leadership, and he's a very cruisy person, very, kind of laid back and cool, like he's good on stage, and he's genuine, he's like a genuine human being. And certainly he plays the executive role, but they all said it's him. Like he sends the culture through the company. And it's just been, we're going to do these things, and they came out with the UCE, and they made a positive impression, and they've built on that ever since. They built a tech center in England. They have a tech center in India, and they have a global design force. You know, they shopped for leadership and production and design crews and product planners. Not coincidentally, were they located in England, not so far from Triumph. And one of the guys I know at Triumph, who was in charge of the Daytona 675 engine, and then got product, Simon Warburton was at Triumph, and he was great to work with, super sharp guy, and he's a big wheel in the British presence in the tech center. So it's been a massive transformation, and it's the leadership of Siddhartha Lal and his passion for riding that infuses the company.
Now, here's an important point to make, and that is that although the original Bullet 350 is a very dated looking motorcycle, and this is no longer produced, by the way, the present motorcycle is related to it in its appearance. But what has happened is that at each model change, the insides of the engines have been advanced into the present day. For example, the addition of a balancer allowed a 5,100 RPM peak engine to jump another 1,000 RPM without being uncomfortable. The balancer makes that possible. You will find that wherever possible, for example, the 450 engine is liquid cooled. And it is not just liquid cooled in the old sense, which is a cylinder sitting in a pot of water. The cutaway shows you that the coolant passages are very thin, which means that the velocity of the cooling water being pushed through there by the water pump is high. High water velocity is essential to good cooling because otherwise water in a stagnant area can over temperature and boil. And steam doesn't conduct heat very well in comparison with solid water. So these are evolving into thoroughly modern engines with all the modern features, such as mapped fueling and ignition, liquid cooling, balance shafts, and in the twins.
Well, liquid cooling's pretty new for Royal Enfield.
Yes, it is.
They have the Himalayan, and then the rest is.
Well, the Himalayan has a special problem. If you're actually going to run your bike at high altitude, you want to run the highest possible compression ratio, unless you're going to supercharge it. So, in general, air-cooled engines don't run very high compression because they can't deal with the intensity of heat flow. So Himalayan has liquid cooling, and it is a thoroughly modern design. From the outside, you can see the linkage to the past because, as Mark just mentioned, Mr. Lal wants to retain the link between the rider and the idea behind this motorcycle. There's another thing, though, that
I wanted to interject. I'd like to interject,
sure.
And then tell us what's fascinating. I talked with a fellow named R. Anbulsovan, and he said this is on the UCE engine when I went to India, the 500, we could have removed at least 2.5 pounds from the cylinder head weight based on our structural and thermal analyses. But the extra material was retained for style. Because it had to have the right look. It had to look right. So tell us what's fascinating, Kevin.
Well, everyone that reads the specs comes down to the bottom line, the price, and it's remarkably low. And it's easy for people to imagine, oh, well, the labor is cheap. Well, the fact is that other companies have factories in India, and some of them are right up the road from the Chennai plant. So if Royal Enfield were paying remarkably low wages, those people could just walk up the road and knock on the door of these other companies and take a jump in pay.
Yeah,
So that's not the answer.
Chennai was described to me as the Detroit of India. So it's on the southeast coast. And when I was talking to Kevin Mahoney, who was importing at the time in 08 when I went over, he described it as a Detroit of India. He said if you were looking to start your own kind of washing machine company in America and you wanted to build washing machines, you could find a factory in Chennai that could probably knock those out for you. So that's sort of what we're looking at. Industrial spot where they're doing lots of work.
Now, it's usual for business school models for manufacturing vehicles to say the largest single item in cost is parts and materials. And the second item is labor. But labor is typically quite small, 20 to 30%, whereas parts are the biggie. So I think that if Royal Enfield are able to make this price, their prices as low as they are, which is between a half and three quarters of comparable vehicles, there has to be something interesting going on. And when I looked for videos, all of the videos were of assembly lines. All the parts had been made. And on the assembly line, they assemble them into a motorcycle. So I went back and I asked the machine to show me automatic transfer lines, CNC machines at Royal Enfield, die casting equipment in use at Royal Enfield. Nothing. But in what Mr. Lal said in some of his quotes gives an inkling. The frames are made by a Thai firm which operates an ancillary operation at Royal Enfield's plants. And I remember when I first went to look at automated radial tire production, the tire companies were very excited by the idea that they could send a knockdown, versatile tire production unit to an automobile or motorcycle factory, and they would make the tires as they were needed, which would mean no shipping, no inventory cost, all kinds of things like this that are simply wiped out. And so I think that there is a new sort of manufacturing that is on the horizon here, and it has to do with having the capability of doing the whole thing, not necessarily in your own plant, but in conjunction with satellite plants located very close to you. And I was delighted to find that it is a Thai die casting company that makes the die casting molds, and then they set up a unit to make the castings. And this is a step beyond just in time, because with just in time, you're tapping your fingers on the desk and wondering if your heart rate is up because the stuff isn't here yet. Well, okay, here comes the truck. Whew. But if it's all close to you and it's under central control, you can eliminate a lot of costs. And I think this is something interesting. This is pioneering work. This is not some strange offshore company that makes quirky motorcycles This is a very ambitious operation that has stated in so many words that they want to dominate the middleweight worldwide.
Well, they are.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So what you're saying about the supply chain, and you say quirky motorcycles, they're no longer quirky. You know, they're just regular old motorcycles. The
Yep.
dealers I've talked to in the United States are like, no, we have very few problems with them. People love them. Young people love them, and old people love them. You know, people who have come up through gold wings and big touring bikes and all that. Like, you take Peter Egan. Peter Egan's had a 411 Himalayan for years, and he just doesn't get tired of it. He just loves riding it, and it's the right size. It's lighter. It's simple. It has enough power. It's everything he kind of needs in a bike, and that's echoed over and over again. Just a simple, honest motorcycle of good quality and of a style that you want to look at for that type of person. I mean, you know, an MT-07 Yamaha, modern, pointy styling, great running engine. Yep, there's plenty of market for that. But Enfield's doing something special here. When I went back in '08, you know, they were struggling with quality, not just their own work in their own factory, but that of the supply chain. And when you saw, like, I went to an accessories shop that was backed up to the river that goes through Chennai, and they had open tanks of plating material boiling away, and in the right side of the shop there was a guy. I mean, it was like 90 degrees, 90% humidity, as you may expect, and he was taking steel tubing, and he had little bucks and fixtures, and he would cut the tubing. He was working on the floor. He would cut the tubing and he would put it into a fixture, and he would hammer the end flat, and it would make the fixture would help make a little round bubble as the tubing went in, and then he would very quickly turn it on a grinding machine to make it round. And he made sari guards. Saris are the clothing, particularly female clothing, and sari guards go over the back so that the saris don't get caught in the wheel. So if you're riding your family around, it's a very common accessory. And handlebars and racks and things. And then they would go next door to plating, and the guy running the shop's like, come on in and have a look. And you walk in and it's like open plating. It felt, didn't feel great. The chrome, they had all the chrome, pieces, the finished pieces hanging up. And at the time it was pretty wavy, and, they were struggling with quality. Now in the 80s, Japanese manufacturers started going into India, and you had Japanese quality because of taxation and protecting the market, you had to have a partner manufacturer in India to do your Hondas. And so was Hero Honda. And when Enfield was doing this, they went and got R.L. Ravichandran, who had been at TBS Suzuki, and Siddhartha Lal said, I worked on him for 2 years to get him to come over. And they established in-house design in 2006, specifically for the 2008 UCE bike. And their head of quality assurance, Dr. K.P. Nair, a really interesting, great guy, and very forthright. He said, we are targeting Japanese quality. We're not there yet. This is as I'm about to get on the 500 single. We're not there yet, but we're 80% there, and we'll keep working. But one of the challenges but both he and Siddhartha Lal described was the supply chain in India.
Certainly.
Because all of those suppliers were not up to standard. And we've had now all this time, and you have Enfield putting pressure on the suppliers to up their game. If you want this contract, you need to get here. And that's what Harley has done. I mean, one of Harley's great advantages is a really mature supply chain that can do finishes, colors, textures, machining operations, chroming, all that stuff, to where you get beautiful liquid paint, super smooth badges it is refined. And that's really one of Harley's great advantages. And now Enfield has apparently a supply chain that can give them all of those things at an incredibly low cost. because
Well,
these are just motorcycles now. It used to be motorcycles with an explanation, like, well, that's just how they are, and they're still, hand striping them. There's two brothers that were doing it in '08, hand striping, consecutive shifts, 6 days a week, every Royal Enfield. I don't know if they're still doing that at 944,000 units, but I believe they are
that
still
is
doing it.
a beautiful video, because the certainty of motion, the operator is rolling the tank and drawing the stripe, and it's just flawless looking. It's quite remarkable. But at the same time, another video shows clear coat going on top of the tanks,
Yep.
and it is right up to the minute painting robots from ABB, which is a huge outfit that does robotics, and the
Well,
robot painters look like they're dancing.
well, when I went through the factory, there were the paint was a guy. They were coming in on hangers, and there was running water behind the parts, and he walked in with a gun and shot him by hand. And then it came around, and the brothers at the time were who is it, Kishore and Jayakumar, consecutive shifts, each and every pinstripe in '08. Amazing.
Yeah.
But we had a picture of the factory, and we had Hindustan machine tools making the old stuff, and then the new stuff was on brightly lighted CNC lines, and then there were some gray-haired fellows working with 18-year-olds is what it looked like, young kids. So there were people there training a new generation of factory worker to assemble the new bikes.
Yeah.
And now it is robotic, and it's every bit of modern manufacturing that you would expect, especially at these volumes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you said you wanted to delete the word craftsmanship from any any OE. I'm sorry, folks, but there are some rare cases of craftsmanship in the sense that you can get custom paint schemes from Harley, and they're really low production, hand done things where there is some of that. But yeah, when you're just knocking out motors, we're not.
And in fact, we don't want it.
Yeah,
we don't want engines that are finished by an elderly gentleman in wireframe spectacles with a leather apron,
hand filing,
taking a file stroke, and then blowing the chips, reaching into his micrometer pocket, making a measurement, shaking his head, reaches for the file. That's craftsmanship. What we want is every part identical within a narrow range, so that you can assemble all these parts together and have controlled clearances in bearings between pistons and cylinders. You don't want those parts to be crafted. Imagine someone crafting 1 billion switches onto a silicon chip. Crafting? Please. There is a way, there's plenty of work for craftsmen, but it isn't in modern mass production. It's in the beauty of that pinstriping. Now, I don't know, as Mark says, whether they continue. Each of those men doing 400,000 tanks a year could be busy.
Oh, there have to be some still getting it treatment. Has to be. Should have asked. Should have called Sid. You really want to be able to assemble your engine from perfect parts. You want your rings to seal. You want everything to be perfectly repeatable, perfect bore surface, so that it just goes together and runs. We can't do any custom fitting. And what it reminds me of is Gilroy Indian or CMC Indian American Indian motorcycles. So at the time, it was like a Harley aftermarket thing where they were using 45-degree V-twin. They had bottle cap cylinder heads, they call them, or the bottle cap rocker covers. And they had been assembling those motorcycles from aftermarket parts, not to a spec. They were calling Baker drivetrain. They were calling a frame builder like Palco or something. And they were getting these bikes in not to a spec, and they were finding that they couldn't put them together, like tolerance stacking or whatever those problems were. they had to basically design. They had to go and say, like, here's what we expect the engine to be. Here's what we think it should be, and then supply that to the supplier and say, like, this is the spec. You need to build your parts to this spec. And I think they improved. And obviously, we're well beyond that with Polaris owning Indian and giving it the rebirth it truly deserved. But yeah, that perfect spec, craftsmanship's great. If I'm gonna rebuild my XS 650 in my garage, I'll hand file those ring end gaps to make sure they're okay.
You bet.
But man, when we're making 1 million units a year, we got no time for that. We don't want that. And it's not repeatable. Like the amount of time it takes to repeat something to the 1,000th like that. I mean, honestly, how many could you possibly make with a bunch of people with micrometers standing around?
Well, hundreds of years ago, there was an organ manufacturer, Arp Schnitger, operating in Europe, built over 500 units during his career. And he independently invented interchangeable parts because when he would get a message from a parish somewhere that had one of his organs saying, well, we're down and we need parts and this and that, it was traditional to send your craftsman to make the repair, which meant while they were away, you weren't building any organs. So he made the reasonable leap to say, what if all the parts are made the same so that you don't have to be a craftsman or a foreman fitter to install them? Then their organ is back online and our factory is producing organs, not at one or the other. So there are a lot of ways to look at craftsmanship. Of course, it's valuable for all kinds of things. And we have to respect it because it's based on experience and thought. But in order to have all these motorbikes at these attractive prices, we have to do something more quickly in every tiny detail so that, as Mark says, take a batch of parts, put them together. It is a motorcycle. Starts, runs, is good.
Is good.
I'm also pleased because I'm pleased at the thought that there is another way to reduce costs than to underpay people. Because when Japanese motorcycles were first coming into the U.S., they were dismissed by real motorcyclists as saying, oh, we all had those Japanese pressed tin toys when we were kids, and the motorcycles are no different. But I knew otherwise because
They were different.
I was working
Stand
with them
back,
every
buddy.
day.
Yeah,
Yes.
they were different.
And soon it became possible, because of mass production, to buy a motorcycle with advanced features such as overhead camshafts, multi-cylinders, electric start, at kickstart prices. That's an achievement.
It is. It takes a commitment too. It takes a vision and commitment to make that leap. Because if like the British, you're comfortably making the same bike that you were making 15 years ago, roughly, or even 30 years ago, and you're just, oh yeah, no, and you're using the same machine tools, like the famous, I think, Norton story, like they moved
Where's
the
me
fact,
stick?
where's me stick, and the guy who had been doing the machining, I don't remember if he didn't move with the factory, but somebody else took over and they were getting chatter on some machining operation. And they called the guy who had previously been running the machine. And he said, oi, where's me stick? And the stick was a big wooden log that you grab, and he would put it down on the rotating part. So it wouldn't chatter.
It took the clearance out. It crowded it over to one side of the clearance. Yeah.
That doesn't work today.
No.
So you can't, you're comfortable making that old bike. The commitment is we're going to die cast these cylinders because we're going to make a zillion of them. We're just going to say we're going to sell them, and we're going to die cast this stuff, and we're going to put electric motors on for starting, and we're putting the overhead cam in. And Honda did it with the CB750. Bang, there it was, inline 4-cylinder overhead cam, electric start, 4 carburetors, quad pipes out the back, shiny chrome, nice looking paint. The early ones were sand cast. Those are the ones that cost a lot now, but hey, just if you want to ride around, don't worry about the sand cast. Just get one of those die cast ones. It takes a commitment and vision, and I think that's Siddhartha Lal had that commitment and vision. I mean, when you look at 25,000 units to where we are now.
The U.S. went through a similar process. Before World War I, manufacturers of premium automobiles knew that ordinary steel did not make a very good crankshaft. So they ordered their steel from France or Germany because it wasn't available in the U.S. The U.S. steel industry was proud of its volume, which was essential to making rails and bridges and steel buildings. But World War I showed that you could not have an aviation industry if you did not have alloy steel and highly precise standards for every threaded fastener, every ball bearing, every single component that was involved in producing the modern manufactured world. And that happened in the United States between the wars. They wrote the standards. When it said, this is 4340 steel, you knew you could rely on it. This is American. This is the standard of the world. The standard of the world is now located in so many places it can't be found. It's a changed world because other countries have passed through the same forced refinement. If you want to make these products, you must have this basis for making them excellent. You can't just say, well, we bought from the cheapest supplier. What's the problem?
Yeah, I think there's the material action and all the motorcycles that Enfield is making, the look that they have, the sound that they have. They've made it with quality, and they're doing things like build, train, race. So you have the entire cultural component, build, train, race in Moto America. Female riders building their own bikes. Freddie Spencer goes in. He's part of the team. In the early days, they were just sending bikes to people and having them build race bikes and show up. But I think what they found to refine that was it's better to do the build in a confined period of time at a shop overseen by somebody who says, yep, all the safety wire is perfect, and we've built the race bike that we should have. Kind of normalize the performance, I think. But build, train, race, they're doing stuff in flat track. It's they're really supporting the culture in that way, and it's a
Yes.
big component. It's a big component for Enfield. The narrative is they did a little bit with the Himalayan, water cooled technology specs. That was part of the presentation and marketing, because it's an adventure-y type bike. So, it has a technical basis of sale, but most of the other stuff does not. And they talk about, it's modern and everything, but it's really like look, sound, and feel, just like Harley was. That was, to me, one of the strange things about Harley's marketing associated with the Softail redo in 2018 was that for decades, it was look, sound, and feel, and certainly they were engineering the daylights out of them to get them through sound and emissions and make them run right. And they put counterbalancers in. Oh my gosh, in the Softails way back in 2000, 2001, somewhere around there, twin cam 88B, and they were doing all of that, but when they got to Softail, it was, here's all these new bikes. They kill the Dyna and they say, 25% more frame rigidity, this, that, and the other. And there's all these numbers. And I just thought, wow, that's a kind of dramatic shift in messaging there. And I wonder,
Very
is that really,
dramatic.
does that resonate? Like it just seemed like an interesting choice to me at the time, because it was, it's not, you can do that with an adventure bike. You can do that with the Pan America, but that's also a strange decision to me too, is like, you've put everyone else out of business in cruisers, big cruisers, and you're just smashing the market, and you can build the same, a similar bike for a very long time and change the styling or change the paint colors, but the fundamental unit kind of stays the same. So you save a lot of money. And then you enter adventure bikes where it's more technically driven. It's not like super sport used to be, where you got to redo it every 2 years, but it's technically driven, and the market is also smaller. But they did it, and it was a great bike, and I wish them well on that. But it was just an interesting shift, and Enfield is really relying on what the bikes look like, how they feel, and the culture around them.
This is the thing. The basis here is that we humans learn more from a story than we do from a list. We love stories. That's why we're on here talking to you, because we're beaming out stories. And this is how we understand the world. Cause and effect, association. And in the midst of all of this, we learn something. So I think that Harley Davidson and Royal Enfield realized that their best promotional idea possible is to create a story in which the prospective buyer wishes to become a part.
100%.
Not to say 14,500 RPM, 54-inch wheelbase. Those things are important, but they're not a story.
Yeah. Well, your self-image, that's where you're writing yourself into that. It's like, what do I want to look like?
Yes. Whom do I want to be?
Yeah. And it's really, I think it's one of the things that many manufacturers have struggled with in the cruiser space. When you look at Ducati and Diavos and BMW, with Harley and Indian, particularly here in America, but even elsewhere, there's a narrative and there's a burned in imprint. I have a photograph of my grandfather on a 1929 Harley Davidson.
Yes.
And certainly I could have a photograph of my grandfather on a BMW in 1929 or from 1929 or 1939 or whatever. But it doesn't look like a Harley. So BMW maybe focus on the bikes that truly look like the bikes that you had. If you want to go retro, be true to thine own self, or whatever you say, but that narrative and that burn into the culture is what is so challenging. So Ducati comes out with a great bike. I mean, we've picked it as the best cruiser. Diavo's really, really fun and wonderful to ride, and it's got its own personality, and but it isn't a volume sales thing. And I'm sure that the parent company's like, how come you ain't selling more of those? It's because they didn't go to Iowa and look at the person in Iowa, because that, like that dude in Iowa, with the Sturgis 96 t-shirt, kind of worn out, stretch neck, corn fed, doesn't envision himself on a Diavo. It doesn't fit his narrative of who he wants to be. It's, where's the American West?
Harley Davidson is the national motorcycle.
Yeah.
There's no issue there. It's something that people think of. There was one in a barn near where I grew up, and they wanted $25 for it. It's always been there. It has always been there, and it has been said about Royal Enfield that every young man has an uncle or a grandfather or someone who remembers Royal Enfield back when? There has always been a Royal Enfield. There's a point also that I don't want to leave out here, and that is that the Enfield bullet, which became the basis of production of RE bikes in India, was a very advanced specification for its time. It had a swing arm rear suspension designed by Tony Wilson Jones, who was always up for innovation. He put plain bearings in his singles for a time. And the Enfield bullet had a telescopic fork at a time when a lot of manufacturers weren't sure whether they wanted leading link, trailing link, some other form of front suspension. But the Royal Enfield bullet pointed the way into the future. It wasn't long before Norton's Manx Racer had telescopic fork up front, swing arm suspension in the rear, all hydraulic damping. No more squeaky stick, slip, dry friction dampers. So the Royal Enfield from which this line has descended was itself of an advanced specification as of 1949. So I like it. I like the idea of regular motorcycles that are reliable, that are reasonably priced, and which don't shout out what role you have to take. Just ride it. Have a good time.
They're accessible and inviting, and that's it. And they're doing the same thing with the narrative that Harley has done. And certainly it's the national motorcycle of India, just the way that Harley is here. But, Enfield's, they're doing it,
Hero Honda sells 5 million machines a year. They sell mostly, as Mark noted, small displacement bikes. Royal Enfield tried making mini bullets. People didn't want them. After World War II, Packard decided that returning servicemen would like a cheap Packard. No. Returning servicemen wanted to look up to the heights and see the aspirational Packard they might one day aspire to. So Royal Enfield know what they're doing. And so far it's working.
Well, it's been a wonderful transformation to watch and experience. Seeing the factory at the time was my first trip to India, and getting to meet Siddhartha Lal. It was just a quirky little manufacturer, a niche. A niche among niches, and who wanted it? Not very many people. And, but they retained their core value and values, and they put an enthusiast at the helm, someone who loved the product and loved the experience. And I have to give Siddhartha Lal all the credit for setting that course and that vision to build the company into what it is now. And it's in the hearts and minds of riders. That's the thing. It isn't, there's no connection to the 55 Bullet from an experiential standpoint. The 26-year-old who's going into an Enfield dealer going like, man, that Interceptor 650 looks pretty cool. Doesn't even, I think it's there in the shadows. It's informing the product as it is, but it's the modern Royal Enfield has made its own mark on the generations. And that's where that generational loyalty is what I was talking about, earlier. There's so many millions of people who have generational relationships with bikes like Harleys and Hondas at this point. You have Honda people and Kawasaki people. Certainly you have generations of that now, but in terms of mass market, Harley has done it for a long time, and Enfield is 100% there. It's amazing. And they're just good. You can go to S&S and you can get a 750 kit. They've got big bore kits and camshafts and exhaust pipes. they were land speeding them. And I was talking to one of the guys over at S&S. I'm like, surely you've scattered these 650s all over the place. He's like, no, man, we built them up and they just run. Like, oh, that's cool. That's great news.
Yep.
Because that's part of the fun, is being able to throw your 750 or 8. I think they have something in the 800cc range that you can slap on top of there, throw some compression at it, pep it up right quick.
Yep.
Well, thanks for listening, folks. That's Royal Enfield. We, as ever, appreciate you listening to the show, watching the show on YouTube or any of your podcast platforms. Octane Lending is our sponsor of this program. There's a link in the description to go to Octane Prequal Flex. Clicking on that link makes a difference. If you want to buy a bike, use Octane. If you need to finance it or want to finance it, use Octane. That helps us directly on this show, and helps us continue to do this on a regular basis, as we love to do it every week, every Wednesday, 60 something times in a row.
You got it. Yep.
We love doing it, and we love sharing with you and hearing from you in the comments. And thanks for listening, folks. We'll catch you next time.